Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today what we're going to tackle is Landsknecht, or Landsknechte to use the plural, which I know I am going to mispronounce a couple of times throughout the rest of the video, so bear with me. But as anybody around here in Germany will attest, there's a K in there, so you pronounce it. Now these guys were a mercenary force in the 16th and 17th centuries, and they were instituted first by Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor, who wanted something that could go toe-to-toe with the famous Swiss mercenaries of the time. They had a reputation for flamboyant dress, and we'll get into why that was as we go through the painting. All of the paints will be listed in the description below. This fella here, he is a Warlord Games Landsknecht. Goodness me. And yeah, let's get straight into it. Of course, the first thing to do is to prime your Landsknecht. And I've used here, this is Vallejo's Grey. You can use anything you like. I would suggest something light, even a bone color or a white will work just fine here. But grey works for me. So as with anything which features outrageous costuming, we're going to have some fun with it. I'm starting here, I have Moon Dust from the Army Painter, and I'm going to paint straight over the top of his big puffy sleeve here. And I'm not worried about hitting the top parts. I just want to make sure that I get that yellow into the recesses, because that's going to be our slash color underneath. So where does the slashing come from? So I had a look, and I've really enjoyed doing the reading on these guys, because Landsknecht, they were pretty crazy. But when they were instituted by Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor, he decided, because they were going to lead such, as I quote, short and brutal lives, that Landsknechte should be able to wear whatever they wanted. So they were exempted from the sumptuary laws at the time, which governed what people could wear. You know, certain professions were allowed certain things, and certain colors were restricted, and so forth. But for the Landsknecht, they were allowed to wear whatever they wanted. So why the slashing? It's an interesting there are a lot of conflicting reports on where this might have come from. I quite like the one that says it was mirroring, a dude would be on the battlefield for a while and he'd end up with all of these cuts and slashes in his clothing, and that sort of became the fashion. You do it preemptively, and it was showing away, just saying, oh, look at how cool I am. Yeah, like anything this old, there's not really a straight answer to where it actually came from, but I like to think a bunch of guys who have got a fairly limited lifespan saying, I'm going to dress like this because I will look fabulous. I'll look like I've already seen danger. But as you'll see, Moon Dust goes on very easily. And what I'm going to do, same too on the little trousery bits here, is just little bits where those slashes are showing through. Now I'm going to use Brain Matter Beige for the other side. Now, not all fashion was quartered like this. Quite often you'd end up with younger fellas who had fairly simple dress. But I like the quartering, I think it looks cool. And this fella having a breastplate, he's probably got a little bit of money, so he's been around a while. His gear is going to look a bit cooler. Now that'll take at least 2 coats in most areas. On his butt, for example, I did have to come back and give it a third, but it is worth that little bit of extra effort. There's actually a Brain Matter Beige primer on the way from the Army Painter, so I am so looking forward to that. But that's the last of the fiddly little sort of clothing bits we need to do first. What I have now is tanned flesh, and I'm going to paint in, well, his skin. Reason being, this is one of those parts where it'll be easy enough to clean up if we make a mistake here, rather than doing all of the little fancy bits first, and then having to tidy up. So straight over his face and beard. But yeah, probably 2 coats of this. Let's have a look at that when this done. Now, the center part of the shirts were normally, or at least could be, I should say, not normally. There's nothing normal about how these guys dress. They would be quite plain by comparison, especially if you had a breastplate. You could get away with hiding something slightly less fashionable from the enemy by just not running away. So I'm using here, this is Monster Brown from the Army Painter, and I'm using quite a few of theirs today. But there's a couple of coats of this. This is a nice sort of felt color. And while we're painting brown, I have here German Camo Medium Brown. This is a Vallejo color, and you can tell because its name is a small novel in and of itself. But I'm just going to paint in his hat. Okay, now that's most of the dull stuff done. Now we can have some fun. I have here, this is Elemental Bolt. We're back to the Army painter, and this is, bar none, my favorite color in any paint range. It is just beautiful. It's a wonderful rich green, and I'm going to apply this very carefully to the high points of the big puffy sleeves and leave the white or the brain matter beige from earlier in the recesses. You can tilt your brush sideways and get a little more control over where that's going. But yeah, that's the easiest way to get the slashed effect on the sleeves. And the same is true for on the leggings here. Let's go ahead. Just avoid the little pinks where the cuts in the cloth are. Wasn't that a nice green? I really love that once that's gone on. We're going to do the same thing to the opposite side, and for this I have Wild Rider Red. Now this is a Citadel color. If you want to stick to the Army painter, like I have been for most of this, Mars Red is a pretty close substitute. Now we're going to do the same thing of painting most of the sleeve in with the top color, but leaving just a little of the yellow showing through. Now we've reached at last the point where I can't avoid talking about it any longer. We need to address the codpiece. Now these are actually a fascinating little bit of fashion history because they started out, they were a modesty measure. Breeches being quite tight, plenty of young men didn't really fancy going around with all of the wedding tackle on display. So a small codpiece, something which would cover everything up so you couldn't see it all expertly outlined, became kind of fashionable, like putting a Speedo on over a wetsuit. But of course, enter the Landsknechte, and these guys, humanity bless us, we've been telling the same joke for thousands of years. And it is, genitals are funny. So you have a bunch of guys who have no laws about how they can dress, what they're required to wear, they aren't governed by any sense of decency other than their own, and they decide, you know what's funny? Strutting around with a giant padded what's it? Sorry. I'm trying to find all of the ways I don't have to say it. But yeah, these were originally, for the Landsknechte at least, kind of a joke, strutting around with these giant padded codpieces, but they would eventually become useful little tools. They were coin purses, they were places to store letter writing implements and stuff like that. As they got bigger, they got more useful. So with a little bit of cork brown, I'm just making a soft felt codpiece for our experienced Landsknecht. And at the same time, I've also used that cork brown to paint in his shoes. Something nice and soft, a nice felt brown works quite well. What I have now, this is Iron Hand Steel, and indeed any fairly bright silver will work quite well for the armor and for his halberd. Reason being, they would have kept quite good care of these. The temptation would be to go for quite dark, grimy metal ordinarily, but you are dealing with fellas whose life's work was going around and making sure they didn't die. So they would maintain their weapons and armor fairly well. But you'll see this goes on very nicely. And yeah, all of the metal bits, let's just dab this in now. I always really like getting the metallics on these guys. It's what makes them start looking finished to me. I've got now leather brown from Vallejo, and, well, no big surprise, I'm going to paint in all of the leather straps. So, of course, it's up to you if you do want to stick to leather brown. Some other colors, like a warmer brown, might also work here. It is your choice. Then with a little Vallejo German grey, I'm going to paint in the scabbard on his knife here. And I'm also going to use this as a color for his beard. Now for any wooden details, I'm going to use beige brown, but as I'm fond of pointing out, it is up to you what you like to use here, whatever you think is most suitable for a wooden color. And finally for our base coats, I'm using sky blue from Vallejo to paint in the feather. Now, these would have been all sorts of colors, sometimes even natural, but very commonly they would have been dyed to taste. And once I finish with this, what I'm going to do is cruise back round, just do any last minute tidy up I need to. Always best, I find, to leave your tidy up stage to last, because you'll save a little bit of time overall that way. Now at last, it's time to shade our figure. And for this, I'm going to use one mix for the whole thing. This is roughly half and half Agrax Earthshade and Lamian Medium, although it might be a little heavier on the Agrax Earthshade. I think that's going to work just fine. So load up our brush and start applying over the entire miniature. You really do want to make sure that you're working it into the recesses, although don't let it settle too heavily, otherwise it's going to get rid of that nice rich yellow that we spent all of that time on. But whatever the case, we need to shade them, so let's go. Once this has been applied, we'll leave it in the sun for about half an hour, maybe a little longer. And once that shade has dried, you'll have something that looks like this. And I really like how this turns out. In particular, I think that the way we've thinned it out makes it settle a little more prominently in the recesses without dulling down much of the color. So we've got plenty of shading, but our colors are still nice and rich. That suits me down to the ground. Now, where it concerns painting Landsknechte, because we're going to be doing, if you are painting an army of them, you're going to be painting a lot. So you want to try and avoid, if you can, having to highlight, which is why I'm not going to highlight his clothing. If you do, what I would suggest would be to grab a little bit of ivory or an off-white color, something nice and bright with a little bit of color to it, and mix that into your base coats. I've done a video on actually highlighting everything with ivory before, but that would be my recommendation. That's an easy way to get this done without having to buy 8,000 paints to highlight every bleeding color you're going to use on a Landsknecht unit. So faces and bases is where it's at to make these guys really work. So I have Cadian flesh tone here, and I'm going to paint over most of his skin while leaving just the recesses untouched. So up around his eyes, for example, let's paint in his brow. And can I get the bottom eyelid? You know what, I'll do that off camera, but leave a little of that shaded stuff in the recess. And we'll come back in a second once I've done that. Now this quite nicely highlights why I like using tanned flesh as the base coat for this, because if we layer over the top with a brown shade like we did, tanned flesh has enough kind of red in it that it makes for a better skin tone than, at least I would say, Bugman's Glow. But what we're going to do now is a final highlight to it, and I've got Kislev flesh here. This is just enough to introduce a bit of depth to the skin. So brows, cheekbones, and a nice fine brush. For once, I'm actually using a small layer brush. When it comes to highlighting his hair, what I've done is, well, exactly what I suggested. I've got half and half German grey and ivory, so mixing those together, and that'll work just fine for a little bit on our brush to highlight his beard. You only want a little bit of this at the time. Keeping control of this is down mostly to having just a fraction of it on your brush. Don't overload that. You should be fine. Now, for me, faces are where a miniature really comes together. And if you don't like painting them, that's all the more reason you ought to practice. There are just one or two last things I want to do to make this bulk infantryman stand out. So I've got here some Nuln oil, and I'm going to apply this over his armor, because I want this to be a little darker. If you are concerned, you can thin this down, same as we did with the Agrax Earthshade, but I don't think you'll need to. And once it's been shaded twice, that's going to be quite dark, so we can go back to our base coat to highlight. So a little bit of Iron Hand Steel again. What I'm going to do is pick out just a few of the areas where I want some shine. So along this big ridge here at the top, and I'll do a little on the bottoms here. It won't take much of that at all, but a little of your base coat back on the metallic stuff, that'll look quite nice. What I'm going to do now is take him outside and hit him with a matte varnish. That's pretty much done. I'll pop a base on him afterwards, and let's get a look at what he looks like when he is all finished. And there at last, our Landsknecht is complete. And I say it all the time, but I really enjoyed painting this guy. It's a lot of fun doing something which I ordinarily wouldn't, or wouldn't do a lot of. But I think this method will work quite well if you are looking at doing large numbers of these guys. As I mentioned at the beginning, the colors themselves aren't as important as the method itself, and knowing when to stop, I think, is an important part of doing such bright miniatures. These guys are going to look the business on the table, whether you painstakingly highlight every edge or not. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, and speaking of that briefly, if this does look better than previous videos, please let me know. The file sizes on these are ridiculous, so if it makes a difference, all the better that I know. As well, to all of my lovely patrons who keep me ticking in paints and glue, thank you very much, as well as my wonderful producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support keeps me, well, in paint and glue. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.